Hello everybody, in this episode I'm going to be showing you guys how to export a project out of Premiere Pro. And we're going to use the method here. I'm going to have another episode later on Media Encoder, but right now I'm just going to show you how to export it directly out of Premiere. It uses the Media Encoder engine, but it doesn't pop it up as a separate program here. So what I'm going to do is, now that I've got my project done here, you want to first of all select your timeline. You want to make sure, right now you notice this highlight right here. If you have a clip loaded up here inside of your source monitor and you have this selected, when you go to export, it's going to want to export out that source clip, which you can do as well, but that's not what we're going to do. So I'm going to select my timeline, just click right there, or you can hit Shift 3, it'll jump to this timeline, and then we're going to go up to File. I'm going to go down to Export and Media. We're going to export media, and the shortcut notice for that is Control M, Command M on a Mac. So now if I hit Control M, it'll bring open this window here. And some things you want to make sure of. First of all, you're going to want to make sure that down here that you are doing your entire sequence. And if you don't have an in and out point on your timeline, it will automatically do that. Let me show you what some of the mistakes people might make here. If I'm in my timeline here and I've somehow accidentally or unintentionally done the letter I, which puts an in point, and O for an out point, I've got this range right here between the in point and out point. Now I hit Control M, it brings this open, and notice this is now saying source range, the sequence in and out. It's just going to export that little portion right there. So I can pull this down and say entire sequence, and that does the entire sequence, or I can cancel this and go to my timeline and clear that. Right click on this and say clear in and out. So you want to make sure that your entire timeline is clear. In fact, I'm going to tilde over this window here, and you want to hit the slash above the enter key, which will bring your whole timeline. If this is zoomed up on something like that, I hit plus a few times. If you hit slash, it'll show your entire timeline. This is a good thing to view before you actually export your clip out, just to make sure there are no in and out points here. And also, you might have a floater clip that sometimes people, when they get editing, will leave a floater clip way down here on the timeline. And what it will do is it will export the entire movie, and then it will export all black up until it reaches that little final clip out there. So I always hit slash and just make sure, the slash above the enter key, and just make sure, the slash above the return key, and just make sure that everything in my timeline, that I have everything in my timeline that I want to be in my timeline. Hit tilde again, and now hit Control M. So just make sure your in and out points are cleared. You can go down here and say entire sequence, which is not necessary now that I've cleared the in and out points anyway. Just good to be safe. Now up here you have your export settings. Sometimes if you're unsure, you can use this match sequence settings here. And what this is doing is it's matching the sequence settings to this format called MPEG Preview. The MPEG Preview is limited to 1920 by 1080, so I wouldn't recommend doing that. I'm going to uncheck that. I'm going to customize this myself. Notice my source sequence here is 3840 by 2160. This is UHD. And my frame rate, since a lot of this was on a cell phone, is around 30 frames per second, and that's is variable depending on your cell phone. But the settings that you want to look at here, at your source settings here, are going to be UHD. Say I want to keep this in UHD. I want to keep it close to 4K. I'm going to go up here and you got two different little drop downs here. You've got your format and your preset. I'm going to pull down format and look at our general formats that we have. H.264 is a really good codec to use if you're exporting for something like YouTube or Vimeo. They actually have some presets for those things as well that are kind of optimized for those websites. If you're mastering and you want to do a higher quality, I would recommend, if you're on a PC, going to DNX. Now keep in mind that these DNX files will not be readable outside of an editing software, or something that will not be readable outside of something like Media Encoder, Premiere Pro, or any sort of editor, or DaVinci Resolve. These are all programs that will understand that, but DNX will not play in something like a QuickTime Player or Windows Media Player, and it's going to be really high quality anyway, and sometimes it will lag and it won't be able to play back for the full frames. But this is a good way to export your project out to a higher quality medium. And after you export that out, you can use that later on down the road. If you delete your whole project, you can use this for your master. If you're sending it to a film festival, they might have certain requirements. If you're sending it to broadcast will have certain requirements. If you're sending it to YouTube or Vimeo, you'll use your master file here. This is what I call your master file to do the compression. You don't want to export to H.264 and then compress even more and more for different types of mediums. But DNX is a good one to use if you're on a PC. If you're on a Mac, ProRes is a really good mastering codec to use. So right now, let's say that we are going to be doing a master. Then I'll show you how to do YouTube here. I'm going to narrow this down to my DNX codecs. I'm going to pull this preset down here, and I've got a whole bunch of different settings that we can use here. I am using UHD, so I'm going to go down to my UHD settings here. And I am using cell phone footage and GoPro footage, so I am not going to necessarily have to do, if you're doing something from like red footage or uncompressed raw footage, you'll want to likely go to RGB 444. Since I'm using since I use a GoPro and cell phone footage with this project here. You'll want to look up the bandwidth data rates on the DNX on Avid's website that gives the bandwidth or the data rate for these files to make sure that you're using lossless quality here. But I am going to go to my UHD files. HQ is going to be, I think it's about like 200 megabits per second, which is kind of overkill, so this will work. I'm going to go 29.97, so that's essentially 30 frames per second here to kind of match the frame rate. If I was using 24 frames per second, I'd select this one. But I'm going to go DNX, HR, HQ, UHD 29.97. And if you ever need to manipulate some things, some items, and I'll show you how to do this here when we go to the H.264 codec for Premiere. But right down here, these ones are pretty much set in stone. Your video settings are, because these are specific codec settings, and these ones are pretty well set in stone. The H.264, you have some things you can change. We have audio, we're using stereo, or you can do multiple channel, but you're going to do video and audio, and just make sure that those things are set. And they are. I've got my resolution set at UHD, and I'm using that DNX preset here. So now I can click on my output name, and it'll bring up a window and say, where do you want to save this? I'm just going to go to my desktop right now, and I'm going to name this Snow Canyon Final Master. I can hit save, and then all I have to do is hit export. Like I said, when this exports out, I'm not going to be able to play it in a media player. I'm only going to be able to read it in something like Premiere Pro and Media Encoder, DaVinci Resolve, Avid, Final Cut, just a whole bunch of different editing software that's capable of understanding DNX. And not even VLC will understand DNX codec. So let's do this for H.264. So I'm going to go down, I'm going to pull down my format and go H.264. Let's say I'm uploading this to YouTube and I want to keep my UHD, because YouTube does understand UHD. It'll do up to 4K. I'm going to pull down my presets. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom. I'm going to click on this little arrow, and actually if you just hit the letter Y, it'll jump to the YouTube category. And now I can arrow down, and here is my YouTube 2160 4K settings. I'm going to click on that, and it will bring up a preset here. And you've got your original source footage here, and then you've got your output here at 30 frames per second, the same UHD and same pixel aspect ratio settings here that this preset is built for. Now, if you want to go higher quality, which sometimes I recommend, it takes a while longer to upload it to YouTube, but because YouTube, once you upload your footage to YouTube, YouTube will actually recompress it. So if you can go a bit higher, it's a good idea, just because there'll be less compression seen in your footage. So let's look at our video tab here. We've got our 3840 by 2160, so that matches there. And if you just hit match source, you can it'll match the things that are checkmarked here. If you hit match source, it'll checkmark all these things, and it will match your source footage all across the board there. Not really necessary with this, but because nothing really changed here, these settings already match our original settings. As we move down to bitrate settings, this is kind of important here. So I just scrolled down under the video tab till you get to bitrate. If you go UHD, it's going to basically double your data rate here. It takes up to 40 megabits per second, which is good quality. But once again, if you want to do a higher quality, you can actually bump this up, and sometimes I'll go up to 80 megabits per second and double the quality of this, so it has a better compression when it goes to YouTube. But notice down here, estimated file size. It actually, let's look at 40. And look down here, it changes it from about 1,544 megabits, about 1.5 gigs, and we go back up to 80, and look what it does. It basically doubles it in size here. So this file is going to be very large, 3 gig. It takes a while to upload to YouTube, especially if you have a crappy internet connection. So just be aware of that. But the quality will be higher. Now let's talk about different settings here. I'm going to pull this down and show you we've got a CBR, VBR 1-pass, VBR 2-pass. CBR stands for constant bitrate. What a constant bitrate does is it will keep the entire file at 80 megabits per second, or whatever you set here. And it just basically does a 1-pass, and it keeps it at this quality. If you're in a hurry, this works well. If you're trying to minimize your file size, what I would recommend doing is using a variable bitrate, 1-pass or 2-pass. I recommend using 2-pass. It goes through the clip twice. It takes twice as long to encode. But what it does is you can actually lower this. You can bring your file size down to 40 and make your maximum bitrate at 80. It will go through your clip one time, and it will measure where there are more dynamic changes, like if there's a lot of action where the camera's moving around quite a bit, or there's a lot of changes in your edits and things like that. It'll set keyframes, and it will go through, and it will bring up the quality when the action happens. When those dynamic changes happen, it needs to bring up your compression data rate during those instances. This is a really good one to use because it'll only bring it up to 80 when it needs it. And then your file size will be a lot smaller. It's estimating around like 1.5 gigs here. but that is a good setting to use. And keyframe distance here is important if you're doing a variable bitrate here. If you put the keyframe distance to get closer together, the size of the file will go back up, and basically what it does is it keeps adding more information, whether it's redundant information or not. But the one pass I wouldn't recommend doing. It's okay. It just if it hits some action, it will suddenly bring up. It'll do it a lot quicker. It'll do it in like half the time. But if it hits that action, it'll hurry and try to pump it up. But then it will be too late, and some of the footage won't look and it will be kind of compressed for a little bit, and then it will get better. So I would recommend doing a 2-pass. So I'm going to click on my name here. And since I've done some changes down here, one thing you might want to look at is audio. The audio settings are really nice, high quality audio settings. It work great for YouTube. I pretty much never change the audio settings when I'm going to YouTube. But if we go to, and notice that it changed the preset to custom. If you want to save those, you can click on this little save preset and name it, and it will save your own preset of what we just changed this to. I'm going to click on the output name, and instead of master now, I'm going to call this, I'm going to hit save, and then we're going to export this out. And if you don't send this to Media Encoder, if you hit Q, it'll send it to Media Encoder. If you just hit export, it will take over Premiere, and you won't be able to do anything in Premiere while it's exporting, but you're seeing it's doing pass 1 of 2, and when that's finished, we'll come back and take a look at the final product. All right, once that's finished, I can go to my folder here where I've exported it out, and here it is, and I got VLC as a player here. I'm going to double click on it, hit F for full screen, and since this is the 4K footage, this is like really kind of laggy. This is a really high quality one with a lot of information, so it will kind of, so if you go high compression rate, if you go kind of the higher quality, it's going to be really laggy. But this one will upload to YouTube. YouTube will recompress it, and it will look pretty good. But I'd say before you upload, test it in something like VLC. If you don't have VLC, download it. You can find it online at I think the Videoland website. Just make sure that you get the package that's off of the Videoland website, not somewhere else, because some people take this open source software and repurpose it and put their little ads and other things into it. So just make sure you get the right installation of it. And those are the basics of exporting your movie from Premiere Pro. If you have any questions, please post them. Let me know. Thanks.